Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapters 28 and 29 in our continuing study of Proverbs. We're still in that central section, the one verse maxims, and we're coming right to the end of that. The second section was Proverbs collected by the men of Hezekiah, and we divided that, chapters 25 through 27, into comparisons. Now, that doesn't mean there's never contrast, but mostly comparisons. And now in chapters 28 and 29, we're going to see mostly the vast majority of these Proverbs will be by way of a contrast. There will be a few exceptions. Let's look. Chapter 28 and verse 1, the wicked flee when no one is pursuing, but the righteous are bold as a lion. You see the contrast there. The wicked, they run even when nobody's after them. They're rather timid, but the righteous, by contrast, are bold and then likened to a lion. Verse 2, by the transgression of a land, many are its princes. Now, this one's a little bit harder. But by a man of understanding and knowledge, so it endures. Now, the idea here is the man of understanding and knowledge, he might be sort of a ruler or a prince as well. But notice, you've got things are going bad, and you have a whole bunch of leaders, and nothing's going right. But here's one man of understanding and knowledge, and then it endures. The NIV renders this. When a country is rebellious, this is verse 2. When a country is rebellious, it has many rulers. You see the many are its princes, many rulers. But then they rendered it, but a ruler with discernment. Now, the term, there's not the term ruler there, so they're being interpretive, but I think they might be right. A ruler with discernment and knowledge maintains order. I think that might be the idea here. We go to verse 3. A poor man who oppresses the lowly is like a driving rain which leaves no food. Now, you don't really expect to see a poor man here, and perhaps for that reason, some of the translations, even though technically that's right, unless it's a figure of speech, sometimes you can describe literally what would be a poor man, but actually it's a figure of speech for something else. That might be the case here. The New International Version renders this a ruler, going back to the previous verse, a ruler who oppresses the poor is like a driving rain, and so on, that leaves no food. Or the New Jerusalem Bible, the wicked oppresses the weak. There's the idea, because it's technically not a ruler, but maybe he's a wicked person, a poor leader, we might say, that sort of idea. And even the Septuagint renders this Andreos, that is a man in Asebies, that is I guess you could say an impious man. We might render it an ungodly man, but the word God isn't there. It's ungodly in the sort of a crude man or somebody like that. And same idea. He oppresses the poor. So you can see where the different translations have perhaps tried to capture what might have been a correct figure of speech. When a poor man usually doesn't oppress the lowly, but a poor ruler can do exactly that. And notice he's like a driving rain, which leaves no food. Rain is a good thing to have in Israel, but when it doesn't accomplish anything, well, what good was that? And likewise, a ruler who doesn't accomplish anything, who only oppresses the lowly, that's not really doing much either. Now we come to a series of contrasts, beginning in verse 4. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law strive with them. So notice, are you praising the wicked, forsaking the law? Notice that those go together. And then by contrast, the one keeping the law is really set up against the wicked. Verse 5, evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand all things. And so notice the understanding there. Verse 6, better is the poor who walks in his integrity than he who is crooked, though he be rich. Remember that normally you looked at rich, and that's an honorable thing to do, but not if they're crooked. So better is the poor who walks in his integrity than he who is crooked, though he be rich. Verse 7, he who keeps the law is a discerning son, but he who is a companion of gluttons, and we haven't talked that much about gluttony. The Proverbs have that it is a theme that you'll see on occasion. But he who is a companion of gluttons humiliates his father. So notice the contrast here is between one who keeps the law versus one who hangs around gluttons. You say, well, what's wrong with having an extra dessert or something like that? Well, maybe what it does, it shows a character flaw. Uh, and notice that it's not talking about the gluttonous man, but the one who is a companion of gluttons. Who you keep company with is significant. Verse 8, he who increases his wealth by interest and usury gathers it for him who is gracious to the poor. So you see the two contrasts here. Here's one who loans out money, but he does so in order to collect exorbitant amounts, even though the people to whom he is loaning really can't afford it. We would call this person a loan shark. Um, and notice he does this. He thinks he's getting wealthy, but instead he's actually gathering for him who is gracious to the poor. In other words, the one who is gracious will be rewarded, and the one who tried to increase his wealth by abusing other people, he will not. Verse 9, he who turns away his ear from listening to the law, even his prayer is an abomination. So here's somebody who doesn't listen to God's instructions, God's laws, or like these Proverbs. And then he prays. And not only does God not answer his prayer, but God sees his prayer as an abomination. Verse 10, he who leads the upright astray in an evil way will himself follow into his own pit. So here's somebody who's leading in a wrong way, and yet he will fall, and he won't fall into somebody else's pit. He'll fall into his own. He's trying to lead people in a wrong way. He's going to be the one that falls in the wrong way. And then we finish this thought out. Notice we've got 3 lines instead of 2. But the blameless will inherit good. And so notice the leading, the following, but by contrast, the blameless. He's going to inherit good. Verse 11, the rich man is wise in his own eyes, but the poor who has understanding sees through him. Remember, it was considered honorable in the ancient world to be wealthy, to be rich. Most people weren't. And he thinks, aren't I smart? And probably a lot of people are agreeing with him, not because he is, but because they want a little bit of his money. But the poor who has understanding sees through him. And so notice the poor person, he has greater insight. Verse 12, when the righteous triumph, there is great glory. But when the wicked rise, men hide themselves. So a contrast between the righteous and the wicked. Verse 13, he who conceals his transgression will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them. So you've got the person who he sins, but he tries to cover it up. But then here's the one who admits his wrongdoing, and he doesn't just admit it and stay there. He admits and then seeks to change, and he's going to find compassion. So notice the compassion, that's from other people, maybe from God as well. I think that works. Verse 14, how blessed is the man who fears always, but he who hardens his heart. So notice the fearing. And that's not necessarily talking about the timid person like we saw at the beginning of this proverb, but I think this is perhaps somebody who fears the Lord, but also doesn't try. He's not arrogant. It's okay to be aware of your strengths, but be aware of your weaknesses at the same time. So here's the one who he's got a proper, understanding of his, well, taken from the previous verse, of his wrongdoing, of his transgressions, and he fears and fears enough to confess and to change. But by contrast, he who hardens his heart will fall into calamity, into evil, into just bad situations. I've marked these as contrasts, but verse 15 is actually not a contrast. It's going to be a comparison. Like a roaring lion and a rushing bear, notice how the translators have added the word like is in italics, but I think it's appropriate. I think this is a comparison. Is a wicked ruler over a poor people. We're beginning to see a theme continuing in most of these contrasts. This is a comparison. The wicked ruler. That one who leads in a bad way. And then we have verse 16, a leader who is a great oppressor, he's also a wicked ruler, lacks understanding, but he who hates unjust gain will prolong his days. So you've got the wicked ruler, the one who is an oppressor, contrasted with the one who hates unjust gain, which reminds us of that person that was getting unjust gain in the previous verses. Remember, the one who collects usury from those who are unable to pay. And now, verse 17, a man who is laden with the guilt of human blood will be a fugitive until death. Let no one support him. So that's a synthetic parallelism. You have the first, in verse 17, the first part of the verse starts the idea. One who's laden with the guilt of human blood. That might be, it sounds like that oppressor. But he will be a fugitive until death. Let no one support him. That finishes the thought. Back to our contrasts. He who walks blamelessly will be delivered, but he who is crooked will fall all at once. And so one receives salvation, one one just comes crashing down. Verse 19, he who tills his land will have plenty of food, but he who follows empty, and our translators added the word pursuits, but I think that's the idea, follows empty things like pursuits, will have poverty and plenty. So notice, this is the idea of the one who works versus the one who he's always chasing after. Maybe it's a get rich quick scheme. Like it's a tongue twister, um, and instead, he never seems to get rich at all. He ends up failing. Sometimes the best way to succeed is just going out and working. And that's what's presented here in verse 19. Verse 20, a faithful man will abound. Oh, notice the plenty. It's actually the idea is there. But now, verse 20, a faithful man will abound with blessings, but he who makes haste to be rich, this is an expansion on verse 19. So you've got a faithful man will abound in blessings, but he who makes haste to be rich will not go unpunished. So he's, the following the empty pursuits, the get rich quick scheme. Sometimes that is its own negative reward. Verse 21, to show partiality is not good, because for a piece of bread a man will transgress. Now, the idea here, Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 23, we saw almost word for word. It might have been word for word in the second line. That started this whole section off. Remember, these also are the sayings of the wise. That started a section off at the end of the Proverbs of Solomon, before we got to the Proverbs of the men of Hezekiah. These also are the sayings of the wise. To show partiality in judgment is not good. So here, notice to show partiality is not good. It doesn't include in judgment, but that might be the idea here. That this is not just showing partiality, but partiality in judgment. For somebody, remember we've already had that ongoing theme of somebody who's a ruler showing partiality in judgment. Why would he do that? Well, maybe he's doing it for a bribe. And that might be here as well. Why? Because for a piece of bread, a man will transgress. In other words, people sometimes take bribes, and that's not a good thing either. So that for a piece of bread. So I think maybe that is the hint of a bribe. And then a man with an evil eye hastens after wealth and does not know that want will come upon him. Now, here you have to understand this is a figure of speech. Sometimes we're not sure if there's a figure of speech or not, but this one is. To have an evil eye is a figure of speech indicating somebody who is greedy, who doesn't want to share any of the good things that he has with the poor. So he's greedy, a man with an evil eye. Notice he hastens after wealth and does not know that want, that is lack of wealth, will come upon him. The greedy person thinks, if I just hold on to my stuff, then nobody will take it from me. But it really doesn't work out that way. Now, that figure of speech for being stingy is repeated when we come to the New Testament. Let's look at this. This is Matthew chapter 6 and verse 20. We're going to do a little excursus here, where we see the same figure of speech. This is Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount. where he says, "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Okay, so verses 20 and 21 very clearly talk about, don't be greedy, don't be holding on to your treasure down here. Store up your treasure in heaven. How do you do that? By spending your money down here, not on just fun stuff, but for helping the poor, for being generous. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Verse 22. Now, if you don't understand that figure of speech about the evil eye, then you come to verse 22 and you think Jesus is changing topics. He isn't. So he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then if your eye is clear, now remember, having a good eye, that's being generous. If your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. So he takes the figure of speech and runs with it a bit. The eye is the lamp of your body. So then if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, remember, that's the figure of speech describing somebody who's stingy. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? So you can miss that verses 22 and 23 if you don't catch that figure of speech. All right, back to verse 23 here in Proverbs chapter 28. And we're still seeing contrast. He who rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than he who flatters with the tongue. Sometimes you need to tell people, hey, don't look now, but you're doing something wrong. Um, if all you're doing is speaking well of somebody when they make a mistake, and you don't give any correction, then that's not a good thing. Um, and so it's better now when you rebuke, when you rebuke, that doesn't mean you're mean about it, but you're doing it for a good purpose so that you can find favor, so that it will go well. I think of one fellow that I worked with one time, and he said, "John, here's this thing that's happening, and it's not a good thing. I didn't necessarily want to hear it, but I needed to hear it, and it was good advice. And I'm to this day I'm thankful for that." Verse 24, he who robs his father or his mother and says it is not a transgression is the companion of a man who destroys. So here's someone who does an evil thing. Now notice in verse 23, this is somebody rebuking somebody. It might not have been evil, it might have been just mistaken, um, and then sets him right instead of the one who just flatters with the tongue. And now here's somebody who does an evil thing. He robs his father or his mother. That's just bad. And says it is not a transgression. He won't listen, won't look, won't recognize the wrong thing he's done. He's the companion of a man who destroys, and really what he's doing, he's destroying himself. Verse 25, an arrogant man stirs up strife, but he who trusts in the Lord will prosper. That almost sort of speaks for itself. The Lord delights in the one who trusts in him, who comes in humility before him, versus the arrogant man. Verse 26, he who trusts in his own heart, no, that's the contrast. One is trusting in the Lord. Here's someone who trusts in his own heart is a fool, but he who walks wisely will be delivered. So notice we have the bad and then the good, and then the bad and then the good. Notice trusting in your own heart is not a good thing. um, we live in a day and age where people say, just listen to your inner voice. And the Proverbs here say, don't listen to your inner voice. Don't trust in your own heart. That's what a fool does. But instead, walk wisely. Listen to the voice of the Lord, and you will find deliverance. Verse 27, he who gives to the poor will never want. We know we've already seen that theme. Remember, the good eye is the generous person. The evil eye, that's the greedy person. He who gives to the poor will never want, but he who shuts his eyes will have many curses. Now you can sort of see why it's called the evil eye. He shuts his eyes to the poor. He doesn't look at their plight and then doesn't do anything about it. And he will be cursed by those very poor and by the Lord as well. Verse 28, when the wicked rise, men hide themselves, but when they perish, the righteous increase. Just that one sort of speaks for itself. Now we come to chapter 29 and verse 1. So we're halfway through chapter 29. A man who hardens his neck after much reproof will suddenly be broken beyond remedy. Notice he hardens. You think, okay, you sort of stiffen up. But in this case, he hardens himself to reproof. He won't listen. And so you think harden doesn't get broken, but in this case, harden does get broken and it won't be fixed. Verse 2, we're back to our contrast. When the righteous increase, the people rejoice, but when a wicked man rules, and notice how often we've seen the rulership theme in these. So when the righteous increase, the people rejoice. When a wicked man rules, people groan. Verse 3, a man who loves wisdom makes his father glad, but he who keeps company with harlots, we haven't seen this theme in a while, but it's there, it's still there. He who keeps company with harlots wastes his wealth. So notice the wealth is connected, but loving wisdom, and in this case, is contrasted with whom you associate in a negative way. Verse 4, the king gives stability to the land by justice, but a man who takes bribes, and we saw that bribe idea there, here it's actually spelled out, but a man who takes bribes overthrows it. So justice brings stability, um, bribery, and remember bribery and what do we call that? When you have corruption, financial and political corruption. In many countries, back then and even today, in many countries, it's almost like a way of life, almost expected. But that's not the way God's people were to be. Verse 5, actually, verse 5 and 6 are going to be a unit. Verse 5, a man who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his steps. Notice the first line it starts the idea and then it's finished by the second line. And you say, well, that's not a contrast, but it will continue into verse 6. By transgression, an evil man is ensnared. Notice how net and ensnared are sort of the same idea, but the righteous sings and rejoices. So verse 5 actually introduces this section, and then you have the evil man who's ensnared. He's spreading a net for his own steps. He sort of catches himself in his own net, and he does that by transgressing. But then the righteous sings and rejoices. Now we have the righteous in verse 7. The righteous is concerned for the rights of the poor. The wicked does not understand such concern. Now, remember the rights of the poor, and we've been talking about the greedy and even the greedy and the ruler who doesn't take note of the poor, who really doesn't care about their situation. So you have the evil, the righteous, the wicked, sort of the evil again, another way of talking about him. And then verse 8, it goes back to the wicked again. Scorners set a city aflame, but wise men turn away anger. So you have these series of contrasts between the evil versus the righteous. Verse 9, when a wise man has a controversy with a foolish man, the foolish man either rages or laughs, and there is no rest. So notice the wise man, he's arguing, that's a controversy, and yet the foolish man either rages or laughs, there is no rest. Reminds me of an old modern day proverb, actually, we use in the firehouse, that I sort of laughingly used to say that you can get 5 firefighters sitting around a table and they'll have 8 different opinions. There's a lot of raging and laughing and no rest and sometimes some foolishness. Somebody said arguing with an argumentative person is sort of silly when you find out he just enjoys it. He's doing it for fun. Same idea here. Verse 10, men of bloodshed hate the blameless, but the upright are concerned for his life. Notice he's not concerned for his own life. He's concerned for the life of the blameless. Verse 11, a fool always loses his temper, but a wise man holds it back. It's good not to lose your temper. You need all you can get. Don't lose your temper. Verse 12, if a ruler pays attention to falsehood, and we've talked about that rulership theme that's been running quite a bit throughout these 2 chapters. If a ruler pays attention to falsehood, all his ministers become wicked. So notice, as go the ruler, so go those who are led by him. Now, that tells me something about leadership. Leadership has the power of influence. It has the power to influence in a good way, but it also has the power to influence in a bad way. Verse 13, the poor man and the oppressor have this in common. You say, wait a second, poor man and oppressor, those are sort of polar opposites. And here is what they have in common. The Lord gives light to the eyes of both. Or sometimes that light looks very different, but God's going to judge. And he looks upon the poor man, and he also looks upon the oppressor, and the end is going to be very different. Now, if a king judges the poor with truth, see how we have that continuing judgment, but also ruler, the Lord's the ultimate ruler. If a king judges the poor with truth, his throne will be established forever. And so this is a call for kings to give fair and equitable judgment. Verse 15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother. Notice rod and reproof. This is about raising children. Um, and the worst thing that can happen to a child is always getting his own way. That's a bad thing. Verse 16, when the wicked increase, transgression increases. Notice how there's a corollary there. But the righteous will see their fall, and that's a good thing. God will balance the books. Verse 17, correct your son. Now we had the child back in verse 15. Now we have the son, and he will give you comfort. He will also delight your soul. So you have, notice the child that gets his own way brings shame to his mother. Correct your son. He'll give you not shame, but comfort and delight. Verse 18, where there is no vision, the people are unrestrained, but happy is he who keeps the law. Now, when you talk about vision here, what is the sort of vision of which we're speaking? Sometimes we get the idea, well, this is have sort of a plan for the future, but that's not really what I think is being presented here. Notice the contrast between no vision is with the one who keeps the law. It's really a vision of keeping the law, of doing God's will. So vision and keeping the law, those are the same. If having no vision is not keeping the law. Verse 19, a slave will not be instructed by words alone, for though he understands, there will be no response. Here's the slave that, you tell him what to do and he doesn't do it. And so this is the idea, he needs some discipline. That's the need for discipline. And you say, well, remember, we don't live in a slave culture today. But the same thing could be said for children. You have to discipline children. And back then you had to discipline a slave if you wanted him to do that which was right. And the idea here is that he's not. Verse 20, do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There's more hope for a fool than for him. Haste in words, that's not a good thing. That's a foolish thing. In fact, notice this, there's more hope for a fool than for him. And then verse 21, he who pampers his slave, notice how we're back to the slave again. He who pampers his slave from childhood will in the end find him to be a son. Now, at first glance, in our translation, it looks like, okay, if it's saying, if you take care of your slave and you pamper him, then he'll be like a son to you. But I don't think that's the idea here at all. I think that's actually misreading that. You see, this is really the same lesson as seen in verse 19. And that's seen especially when we look at that last phrase, will in the end find him to be a son. See that term? That's not the word ben, which is normally the word for son, or even the Aramaic bar. It's man on. And this is actually an unusual word. This is what's called a hapax legomena. The term hapax legomena means this is the only time this word is ever used in the Old Testament. New Testament too, for that matter. The only time this term is ever used in the Bible. And that makes it a little tough. Sometimes when a word is used only once, it's hard to get your handle around the meaning of it, if it's a term that's that rare. But here, the Legacy Standard Bible, that's the updated translation of the New American Standard, they actually render this arrogant. They've corrected their translation, and I think it was a good correction. Notice, he who pampers a slave from childhood will in the end find him to be arrogant. Well, that sounds exactly what we were saying back in verse 19. A slave will not be instructed by words alone, though he understands there'll be no response. He needs discipline. The New International Version renders it, he will be insolent. And again, I think that's the same idea, arrogant, insolence, the same idea. The New English Translation renders this a weakling. That's okay. I think that those first two really have the right of it. That pampering. Let me just say also, this works for employees as well. Now, yes, this is spoken about slaves, not employees, but I think the application can be made. When you have an employee, if you don't correct them, when you have an employee, if you pamper them, don't have them do any work, you're not doing them any favors. They're going to get arrogant. They're going to be insolent. They're going to be no good. They're going to get fired. That's not a good thing. So we have a bad thing taking place in verse 19, a bad thing taking place in verse 20, and here in verse 21, a bad thing again. All three of these are negative situations. Verse 22, an angry man, and here's another bad situation, an angry man stirs up strife, and a hot-tempered man abounds in transgression. So we have four bad things in a row that are given here. Next, we're back to the contrasts. Verse 23, a man's pride will bring him low, but a humble spirit will obtain honor. So notice pride is contrasted with humility. One brings you low, one obtains honor, and that's good. Verse 24, he who is a partner with a thief hates his own life. And so here's somebody, he's not stealing, but he's working with somebody that is. And that's not good. He hears the oath, but tells nothing. And the term oath, the Allah, can refer to the oath or the curse, I suppose it could be. And the second line is helping us explain the first line. He's partnering with a thief. There's an oath that says he ought to be doing good, but it doesn't do anything. It only goes skin deep, and he finds himself walking in the way of the thief, and in the first line, he notice hates his own life, maybe even suffering the same consequences as the thief. Coming to the last three verses, verse 25, the fear of man brings a snare, but he who trusts in the Lord will be exalted. We've seen, notice the fear of man, being afraid of people instead of being afraid of the Lord. That's the idea here. Fear of man versus the fear of God. But he who trusts the Lord will be exalted. Verse 26, many seek the ruler's favor, but justice for man comes from the Lord. Again, the same idea, trusting the Lord, having that proper fear of the Lord, that comes from the Lord. And then finally, verse 27, an unjust man is abominable to the righteous, and he who is upright, so you notice you're going to have repetition of that word abominable. An unjust man is abominable to the righteous, and he who is upright in the way is abominable to the wicked. So, you're going to be abominable, but to who? To the righteous or to the wicked? Are you going to follow the Lord, or are you going to seek after the bribes and the things of just worldly rulers? Are you going to trust in the Lord and be exalted, or will you find yourself ensnared? So these contrasts close this section of the book of Proverbs.